you and I know that in reality the War of 1812 was a tie, basically. Nothing really changed. There were no major consequences. But this didn't stop Americans from claiming a great victory, a second great victory, over the most powerful nation on the planet, the United Kingdom. And it led to a period of intense nationalism, a great national pride in America. But the War of 1812 did more than that. It exposed weaknesses in the American system, weaknesses in things like transportation and finance. The first bank charter had expired. Hamilton's Bank had expired. It had only been chartered for 20 years. And it was not rechartered. It just ended. There was no national bank. And so money began being issued by smaller banks. The Bank of the United States had issued the money. And this led to mass confusion and inflation as there was lots and lots of different currency and nobody was quite sure what it was worth. This also created the problem of counterfeiting. If you don't have one currency that everybody recognizes, it becomes fairly easy to make fake currency. So in 1816, we'll recharter, or actually charter a second bank. It's called the Second Bank of the United States. And this is actually even bigger than the first bank. But even this bank could not stop others from issuing paper money. So it did help to stabilize the economy, but not entirely. Manufacturing is stimulated by disruption in world trade. The War of 1812 obviously cut off trade with Europe as we couldn't get there because of the British fleet. And one of the positive effects of that was a boom in things like textiles, things that we had traditionally bought from Europe, we're now having to make ourselves. Textiles means cloth for clothes, by the way. The number of cotton spindles, these are things that turn cotton into thread, will increase 15 times, a 15-fold increase in cotton spindles between 1807 and 1815. We also have Lowell will develop a power loom in Massachusetts, and this will be better than anything in Europe. It'll be the most efficient, productive looms turn thread into cloth in the world. And will be the beginnings of America's first great economic boom, which is in the textile industry. We also pass a protective tariff. We put large taxes on goods coming in from Europe, so people will be forced to buy the American good because they can't afford the European good. Now, this is great news if you live in the Northeast, but it's terrible for the South, who buys more imports. Remember, the South, they're growing cash crops. They don't have manufacturers. And so tariffs will generally be popular in the North where they make the stuff, but unpopular in the South where they tend to have to buy the stuff and pay the higher prices. The other issue that became exposed is transportation. And the question was, what was the government's role in basically encouraging business growth? Should the government fund what were called at the time internal improvements, or things like roads in the case here? The sale of Western land paid for the federal government to build a road. It's called the National Road, and it ran from Washington, D.C. Into Ohio, and eventually into what is today Indiana. Illinois. Some states also financed roads. Pennsylvania had built something called the Lancaster Pike. But these were toll roads. You had to pay to use them. But they were built by the government. Others argued that this was a place for private industry, that this shouldn't be being done with government money. We're also going to see the beginning of steamboats. We'll talk more about them later. And they created cheap shipping from Pittsburgh all the way down to New Orleans. And if you're a country that is growing a lot of crops in its interior, in its west or its south, the ability to get those crops to market is vital. And so this transportation network is absolutely necessary for us to become a significant economic power. But one problem was the Appalachian Mountains. We had no real way to get across these mountains that run there kind of on the edge of Virginia there and all the coastal states. And so there began to be a divide between the east and the west, which were not connected through any transportation throughway. John C. Calhoun, one of those war hawks we talked about last time, will push a bill through Congress to fund improvements on coastal roads, but Madison will veto it. Remember, the Democratic Republicans at this time believe in small government. They don't want the national government doing all these things. And so despite building this national road, the reality is that the argument at the time is this should be done by either state and local governments or done by private companies, improving the transportation system. And so the federal government doesn't do much beyond this national road to improve transportation. We're growing. By 1820, the West is actually growing faster than the East. Between 1800 and 1820, the U.S. population doubles from 5.3 million to 9.6 million. Still only about half of what's in New York City today, but big for the time. The East is, of course, filling up. The land is largely owned. Large plantations dominate the South. So immigrants and young people looking to start a new life head west, as they've done from 1607 when Jamestown is founded. After the War of 1812, of course, we've also pushed the Native Americans out of what we call today the Midwest. And this allows for a rapid expansion into this area here, all the Big Ten football teams, right? Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, what will become Michigan and Wisconsin. And that area grows very quickly. Cincinnati becomes a major city as it's at the juncture of two major rivers. And that becomes the major western city at this time. People out in the West tend to live in things like lean-tos and huts. Of course, they had to get out there and build their own homes, often clear their own land. They lived in extreme isolation. They would usually get there and it would be a wilderness, and they would have to cut the trees down and pull all the stumps to turn it into farmland. They were very communal. Communities would sprout up fairly quickly, and they would gather to help their neighbors. And so you might get together to build a school, all the people in the community, or raise a barn. There's this idea of rugged individualism and everybody doing everything on their own. But historians have shown that really wasn't how it was. In reality, they would team up to do large projects together as a community. Even harvesting would be done kind of as a giant community with everybody helping to harvest everything. Now, what was interesting is these people tended to move out, turn open land or forest into farmland, build a home, and then sell it to a new person coming along, and then move out a little further west and do it all over again. And so it's really the same people just continually moving west, turning it into workable farmland, selling it to somebody who has a little bit of money, and then funding their lives that way. So the actual pioneers, the people who are going out there and creating farms, had this pattern of creating a farm, selling it, creating another farm, selling it, creating another farm, selling it, which is interesting, of course. In the South, we discover the Black Belt, which runs through central Alabama and Mississippi there in the South. And this is an area of very rich black dirt that's extremely good for things like growing cotton. And this is when cotton will begin to become the major crop of the South. And again, this starts with a small farmer who comes in, clears some land, maybe builds a shack, a little hut. And then a wealthy planter will come in and buy the land once it's been cleared off and turn it into a large plantation. The small farmer moves west and does it all over again. They tend to live in log cabins. They would actually start with, like I said, huts or shacks. These would be improved into log cabins, and of course, by the time the wealthy landowners come in, they would begin to build these southern plantations, these mansions that we think of. But that would usually take a few decades before they got to that level of development. The demand for slaves is going to skyrocket after declining a lot in the early 1800s. During this period in the 18 teens, we're going to see the demand for slaves explode as cotton becomes a major cash crop. We're going to add new states. Indiana becomes the 19th state in 1816. Mississippi becomes the 20th state in 1817. The next year, Illinois joins the Union, and then Alabama becomes the 22nd state in 1819. And so we're very quickly adding new states. As for the far west, this area here that says unorganized territory, and really even into the part that says Spanish possessions, we don't really think much about that. We don't really care much about that. But it is important to point out that Mexico will fight a war and win its independence from Spain in 1821 and open up trade with the United States, so America and Mexico will enter into an economic relationship. Americans will pour in, particularly to the northern part of Mexico, what is today places like Texas and New Mexico, which many Mexicans consider to be too hot. Mexico is closer to the equator, so you might expect it to be hotter, but it's also on a plateau. It has raised elevation. So Mexico is actually quite cool. And the Spanish and then later the Mexicans didn't really see much use for places like Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, Utah, because they considered them to be too hot to live in. They also had lots of Native Americans. But the Americans will displace the Native Americans. Mexico will also buy a lot from America. America is able to offer better goods at cheaper prices. And Mexico will lose control of its own markets and its own borders fairly quickly, almost instantly, in fact. White trappers in the West will compete with Native Americans in the fur trade. And a man named John Astor will develop contracts with these mountain men. and will come to monopolize the fur trade from the American West. And his American Fur Company will become kind of the first great massive corporation in American history. And he'll become the richest man in the New World. Few white men lived in the West, and even fewer women and children. White men, women, and children anyway. These tended to be mountain men who would go out to remote areas, trap animals for their furs, sell them to something like the American Fur Company. They would intermingle with the Mexicans and the Native Americans, oftentimes marrying and having children, and creating this mixed race white Native American population out in the American West. But still, the population is very small, particularly the white population. Now, back east, nobody thinks much about the American West. Once you get past the Great Lakes, let's say, or once you get to the Mississippi River, that area is just not on people's minds. The U.S. government will actually send Stephen Long into the what we call the Great Plains today, and he will mislabel it. He'll call it the Great American Desert. He goes there at a time of particular drought, and the Great Plains had virtually no trees on them at all. And he will assume from this that there's no rainfall there ever, and it's not good farmland. This is, of course, comical. The Great Plains is one of the great farmlands in all the world. But for generations, Americans will avoid what we call the Great Plains today because of this mistaken notion that it is a vast desert, a wasteland.